The year is 1858, and you're in London, the height of the Victorian Era, a city bursting with innovation, industry, and an unbearable stench. It's the sweltering heat of summer. The River Thames turned toxic. The smell was so foul, so overwhelming, that it brought Parliament to a halt and the city to its knees. This was no minor inconvenience. It was a crisis of epic proportions, born from centuries of neglect and a complete misunderstanding of public health. Hi guys, and thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we're diving into the shocking true story of the Great Stink, how raw sewage, scientific breakthroughs, and one visionary engineer changed London forever. But before we dive in, if you enjoy this story, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to my channel. Get in your comfy place and let's get started. By the mid-1800s, London was the largest city in the world, home to over 3 million people. But beneath the surface of this booming empire lay a problem no one wanted to face: sanitation. London's population in the 19th century was exploding. But why? The answer lies in the forces that were reshaping Britain and the world. The Industrial Revolution had transformed London into a global powerhouse. New industries meant new jobs, and people flocked to the city in search of work. Between 1801 and 1851, London's population more than doubled, from just under 1 million to over 2.3 million. Many came from rural areas. As agriculture became more mechanized, fewer workers were needed on farms, pushing people toward the city in a massive wave of urban migration. And London wasn't just growing from within. It attracted immigrants and traders from across the British Empire and Europe. The city was also becoming a melting pot, vibrant, diverse, but also overcrowded. But the infrastructure couldn't keep up. Housing was thrown up quickly and often without proper sanitation. Streets were narrow, drains were open, and waste management, well, it was almost non-existent. And all of this meant one thing: more people, more waste. And guess what? Nowhere for it to go. The River Thames became a giant, slow-moving sewer. And by 1858, nature had finally pushed back. This population growth is exactly what made the Great Stink not just a health crisis, but a symbol of how unprepared Victorian London was for modern urban life. For centuries, Londoners relied on cesspits and open sewers. Human waste, it was dumped into the streets, into the gutters, and eventually into the River Thames, the very same river that supplied the city with its drinking water. All kinds of waste ended up in there, some of it truly shocking by today's standards. Perhaps the most obvious and dangerous was human waste. Most homes didn't have flushing toilets until the 1840s to the 1850s. People used chamber pots and cesspits, which were often emptied directly into drains that led straight to the river. After flushing toilets became more common, things got worse because the sewage systems weren't built to handle them. They flushed waste even faster into the Thames. Soapy water from laundry, dirty dishwater, bath water, and food scraps were also frequent visitors to the River Thames. Most homes had no proper plumbing, so anything poured down a sink or a gutter eventually made its way to the river. Factories and workshops along the Thames also dumped waste directly into the water, including chemicals, dyes, acids, and metal runoff. Tanneries and slaughterhouses added animal blood and fat, and breweries and distilleries, well, they disposed of grain and waste and fermentation byproduct. So what was the result? A river thick with sludge, disease, and decay. The water was brown, it was greasy, and often described as more like a soup than actual water. It frothed, it bubbled, and it stunk, especially in the summer. The consequences of this were deadly. Cholera outbreaks swept through the city in 1831, 1848, and again in 1853, taking the lives of tens of thousands of people. But at that time, no one understood how disease truly spread. According to the popular belief of the day, it wasn't bacteria, but it was bad smells, foul, poisonous air that caused illness. And in the summer of 1858, London would face the worst stench in its history. That June, temperatures soared above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, or 32 degrees Celsius. The polluted Thames, choked with raw sewage, became a simmering cesspool. The smell was indescribable, but let's try and take a stab at trying to describe it. Imagine the stench of human waste, rotting meat, and chemical sludge, all stewing under the sun. A thick, sour, putrid fog hovered over the riverbanks, seeking into people's homes, offices, and even the halls of Parliament. The smell was described as sickly sweet and stomach-turning, like the stench of an open grave, mixed with open sewers, boiled cabbage, and festering corpses. People actually gagged in the streets. The stench was inescapable. It clung to the air, crept into homes, soaked into your clothes, and it changed daily life in London. People couldn't just hold their noses and carry on. For weeks, the city practically ground to a halt. The smell was so bad in the Houses of Parliament, right next to the Thames, that debates were cut short or postponed entirely. Lawmakers soaked curtains in chloride of lime and drenched their handkerchiefs in perfume. But nothing worked, and at one point, there were discussions about relocating Parliament altogether. Most homes and shops near the river sealed their windows with lime-soaked cloths, despite the sweltering heat. People avoided going outside if they could, especially near the embankments. Street vendors and dock workers, well, they lost income. People just refused to go near the riverfront. And here is the worst. Many Londoners still drank water taken from the Thames, even as human waste floated visibly past their windows. And that's where one man, Joseph Bazalgette, stepped in. A civil engineer with a bold vision, he proposed a radical solution, a modern, underground sewer system that would carry waste away from the city and finally cleanse the Thames. What followed was one of the greatest engineering feats of the 19th century and a turning point into urban sanitation history. While most of London held its nose, one man got to work, Joseph Bazalgette, a name few knew at the time, but one that would reshape the city forever. A civil engineer by trade, Joseph had long warned that London's sanitation system was disastrously outdated. After the Great Stink made the crisis impossible to ignore, Parliament finally gave him the green light, and more importantly, the funding. So, what exactly was his plan? Well, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Over 1,300 miles of underground sewers, connected to massive intercepting sewers along the Thames, designed to capture waste before it entered the river and divert it downstream away from the city. It was one of the most ambitious public works projects in British history. Thousands of workers, many of them Irish laborers, toiled for over a decade to build the network. They dug by hand, braved floods, cave-ins, and disease. The sewers weren't just functional, they were beautiful. Joseph insisted on over-engineering everything. If his calculations called for an 8-foot pipe, he built a 12-foot one instead. His reasoning? Well, because one day, London will be bigger, and we must build for that day. And the system worked. For the first time in living memory, London's river began to recover. The smell faded, all of the disease outbreaks stopped, and the city, it could finally breathe again. Joseph didn't just build sewers, he built the foundation of modern urban sanitation. His design, it still serves London today, over 150 years later. And yet, like many great public works, his legacy flows quietly beneath our feet, invisible, taken for granted, but utterly essential. Joseph's grand vision, it wasn't cheap, and it was not quick, but it was one of the greatest infrastructure projects the world had ever seen. The original estimated cost was around £2.5 million, but by the time it was completed, the final cost had ballooned to over £6.5 million. That's equivalent to more than £1 billion today, adjusted for inflation, of course. This project ended up taking about 10 years to complete with the help of an estimated 20,000 workers. They dug hundreds of miles of tunnels, often by hand. They moved millions of bricks. They worked in gaslit darkness, knee-deep in sludge, with a constant threat of cave-ins, gas leaks, and disease. And yet they built a system so well designed, it still serves London today. Thanks to Joseph and the thousands who worked under him, London emerged from the stink with a cleaner river, a healthier city, and a new understanding of what public infrastructure could, and quite honestly should be. And the world was watching. Cities like Paris, Berlin, New York, Chicago, and others soon followed London's lead, building their own underground sewer systems, often inspired by Joe's design. As science advanced and germ theory replaced the old bad air beliefs, it became clear. Sanitation, it wasn't just about smell. It was about survival. Clean water and proper waste disorder would save millions of lives in the decades to come. Today, we rarely think about what happens after we flush the toilet. We take clean water and working drains for granted. But it all started with a stink so bad, it shut down Parliament, and an engineer who dared to dig deeper. The Great Stink may have faded from memory, but its lessons are still flowing, just beneath our feet. But the Great Stink, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the foul culmination of decades of rapid change. To understand why London's river turned into a reeking cesspool, we have to look at what came before, the Industrial Revolution. While it brought progress, jobs, and booming cities, it also brought overcrowding, pollution, and a total collapse of sanitation. In many ways, the Great Stink wasn't a surprise. It was inevitable. In the summer of 1858, the city of London was brought to its knees, not by war, not by famine, but by the unbearable smell. A choking, sickening stench rose from the river, forcing Parliament to hang their soaked curtains in desperate attempt to block it all out. But this wasn't just about bad sewage. This was the price of progress. The Industrial Revolution had transformed London into a global powerhouse, but beneath the soot-covered skyline and booming factories, a very human problem was festering, literally. How did innovation, industry, and invention create one of the foulest crises in urban history? Let's now dive into Industrial Revolution's dirty little secret and how it nearly drowned Victorian London in its own waste. By the mid-1800s, London was the beating heart of an empire, and the Industrial Revolution, well, was its engine. Steam powered the factories, coal darkened the skies, and rural workers poured into the city in search of jobs and opportunity. But this explosive growth, it came at a cost. The city's population doubled in just a few decades, swelling far beyond what its centuries of old infrastructure could handle. Homes were packed tight, streets were filthy, And worst of all, there was no proper sewage system. Human waste, industrial runoff, and chemical byproducts all had one place to go, in the River Thames. The very river that once symbolized London's power had become its open sewer. One of the most unexpected villains in this whole mess? The flush toilet. Yep, modern plumbing. Humanity's proud step into cleanliness accidentally made everything worse. Thanks to industrial mass production, flush toilets were suddenly all the rage in middle-class homes. But there was one tiny oversight. Victorian London didn't have a sewer system. So where did all that flushed waste go? Well, if you were listening to my earlier segment, straight into the Thames, or onto the street, or into your neighbor's basement, if you were really unlucky. At the same time, factories were popping up everywhere, pumping out iron, textiles, and enough chemical sludge to make the river glow in the dark. Add in slaughterhouse runoff, dead animals, and about 2 million people's worth of daily business. And you've got a river that was less majestic waterway and more toxic soup with extra chunks. And it gets worse. People were still drinking water from the Thames. Imagine sipping from a cup that doubles as the city's toilet. All of this, the toilets, the factories, the overcrowding, was the unflushable gift of the Industrial Revolution. London had embraced progress with open arms, but forgot to take out the trash. So let's rewind. What was the Industrial Revolution exactly? Picture this. For centuries, most people lived in small villages, worked on farms, and made everything by hand. Clothes, tools, even food. But around the late 1700s, that all changed. Machines started doing the work that people used to do. And guess what? They did it faster. Way faster. This explosion of new technology, steam engines, textile machines, coal-powered factories, kicked off what we now know and call as the Industrial Revolution. It began in Britain. In London, well, London was right in the middle of it. And suddenly, the city went from being just another European capital to the beating heart of a global empire. All of these factories, they needed workers. Railways, they needed builders. Businesses needed clerks. And people from all over the country, especially from the countryside, came running for a slice of that opportunity. Why stay on a muddy farm when you could move to London, earn a wage, and maybe even a pair of shoes and a clock? But here's the catch. London wasn't ready. Its medieval infrastructure was built for a few 100,000 people, not millions. So as the city ballooned, so did the problems: overcrowding, pollution, and the kind of public sanitation nightmares that would make a Victorian faint into their gin. So you've left the countryside, dreaming of a better life in a booming industrial London. Well, congratulations, you've made it. Except now you're sharing a one-room flat with 7 other people. The roof leaks, the walls are moldy, and there's a suspicious smell coming from the corner that no one's been brave enough to investigate. Welcome to the slums. Entire neighborhoods were thrown together almost overnight to house this extremely large growing workforce. These weren't cozy cottages. They were rows of hastily built tenements packed so tightly you could borrow sugar from your neighbor through the wall. Running water? Nope. Toilets? Maybe one for the whole street. Privacy? Forget it. Most families lived, slept, and ate in a single room, sometimes sharing it with another family just to afford the rent. Waste often got dumped right outside the door or straight into open streets, mixed nicely with horse manure and factory runoff. And as for those jobs everyone came chasing, let's just say the posters left a few details out. Factories were loud, dirty, and dangerous. Workers, including children, put in 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, in poorly ventilated spaces filled with smoke, dust, and toxic fumes. Forget brakes or safety regulations. If your hand got caught in a machine, your boss probably replaced you faster than the bandages could come off. Steam-powered machinery didn't just speed up production. It sped up accidents, injuries, and exhaustion. You'd leave work covered in soot, coughing from coal smoke, and return to a home that smelled like sewage. Dream life? Well, not exactly. The irony? The Industrial Revolution promised progress and prosperity, but for millions of Londoners, it meant cramped housing, deadly jobs, and rivers that literally steamed with filth. Okay, but wait. How did machines suddenly take over everything? Why were they so popular in the first place? Well, the short answer is they made everything faster, cheaper, and more profitable. And in the world of business, that's basically the Holy Trinity. Before the Industrial Revolution, most things were made by hand. Clothes, tools, furniture, you guys, even nails. That meant that production was slow, expensive, and limited by how many people you had working with, well, their hands. Then enter the machines. Inventions like the spinning jenny, the power loom, and the steam engine changed the game completely. One machine could do the work of dozens of people, and it didn't get tired. It didn't take lunch breaks or join a union. Factory owners sold dollar signs, or I guess pound signs in this case. Machines could mass produce textiles, iron, and goods faster than ever, and then sell them for a profit. Britain was basically printing money in cotton and coal. And once the steam engine came along, thanks to James Watt, everything sped up. Trains moved goods faster, machines ran harder, and entire industries could operate non-stop. It was the 18th century version of going viral. And the government loved it. Investors, they threw money at it. And suddenly, every entrepreneur wanted a factory full of machines. It was the ultimate get-rich-quick scheme, and it worked, at least for the people at the top. So what was the result? A booming economy and a workforce crammed into slums, working themselves to the bone just to keep those machines running. Machines made life easier for business owners and a whole lot harder for everybody else. So while machines were transforming factories into money-making powerhouses, they were also dividing London into two very different worlds. On one side, the industrialists. These were the factory owners, investors, and business tycoons who rode the steam-powered gravy train straight into large piles of cash. They lived in spacious townhouses, far away from the stink, often uphill, conveniently out of reach of the worst smells and diseases. Their toilets flushed, their wine cellars were stocked, and their hands, not a callus in sight. But on the other side, the workers who actually kept those machines running, they were crammed into slums, breathing factory smoke by day and sewer air by night. Most of them couldn't afford proper food, let alone a doctor, and many didn't live long enough to retire. Kids were sent to work before they could even spell chimney, and clean drinking water was a luxury, not a right. While the upper class debated sanitation in Parliament over brandy and cigars, working-class Londoners were literally dying of disease because they were drinking water laced with human waste. The Great Stink didn't affect everyone equally, at least not at first. The rich could escape it, at least for a little while, but when the stench finally invaded Parliament, it became clear. Even money can't buy fresh air when the whole city's sewer is flowing through your front yard. It was one of those moments in history where rich and poor were actually united by the smell of their own civilization turning against them. Now, if you think the Great Stink was just about bad smells and poor urban planning, think again. Because London's sanitation crisis didn't just offend noses. It killed people, and lots of them. The Industrial Revolution created the perfect storm for public health disasters. You had millions of people packed into filthy, damp housing with little to no ventilation, almost no clean water, and zero sewage management. Think of it as a petri dish, but with more coal smoke and fewer doctors. Enter cholera. Between 1831 and 1866, London suffered 4 major cholera outbreaks. Thousands perished in each one, often within hours of showing symptoms. At the time, people believed in miasma theory, which basically said that bad smells caused diseases. So naturally, the river reeking of raw sewage raised some eyebrows. But here's the kicker. It wasn't the smell that was killing people. It was the fact that their drinking water came from the same river where the entire city was dumping its waste. London was, quite literally, drinking its own filth. It took a doctor named John Snow, and in case you guys are wondering, no relation to the guy in the north, to figure it out. During a cholera outbreak in 1854, he traced the source to a contaminated water pump. He removed the handle, and boom, the outbreak, it slowed down. Simple, genius, and totally ignored by most of the establishment for years. Because again, the leading theory at the time was, if it smells bad, it must be evil, which was only half true. The end result? Tens of thousands perished, repeated epidemics, and a growing awareness that maybe, just maybe, living in a giant open sewer wasn't ideal for human health. And all of this paved the way for one of the greatest engineering feats in London's history. Now, up until this point, public opinion on London's sewage problem was, let's just say, tolerant. People complained, sure, but for the most part, they just sort of lived with it, like pigeons or taxes or that one neighbor who always burns fish. It wasn't like they liked the smell. They just didn't expect anything better. Most Londoners had grown up with open drains, air-flowing cesspits, and river water that looked like it could peel paint. Gross? Absolutely. But at that time, completely normal. And then came the tipping point, the summer of 1858, the Great Stink. The heat turned the Thames into a bubbling cauldron of disease and decay, and suddenly, the smell couldn't be ignored. Not by the newspapers, not by the doctors, and definitely not by the politicians whose offices sat right on the riverbank. The press, well, they had an absolute field day. Public outrage, it exploded. People were demanding answers, action, and most of all, demanding someone else deal with the sewage. Pamphlets were printed, protests were held, letters were written, in ink, in righteous fury. The government could no longer pretend it wasn't a crisis. They couldn't sit in Parliament behind vinegar-soaked curtains and pretend everything was fine. Public health was collapsing. The economy was at risk. And worst of all, well, the wealthy people were inconvenienced. And that, more than cholera, more than poverty, more than decades of human suffering, that was what finally lit a fire under the British government. The people wanted a solution, and the government, desperate to save face and their sense of smell, finally gave them one. And well, you guys know the rest of the story. Joseph rolled up his sleeves, he drew up the blueprints, and built one of the most ambitious sewer systems the world had ever seen, the one that finally dragged London out of the muck, literally and figuratively. The Great Stink may have lasted just one sweltering summer, but it was centuries in the making, fueled by innovation, overpopulation, bad science, and a whole lot of bad smells. The Industrial Revolution gave London its factories, its wealth, and its global power. but it also gave the city an overwhelming waste problem that couldn't be ignored forever. It took a river full of sewage, thousands of lives lost, and a parliament gasping behind lime-soaked curtains to finally say, maybe we should fix this. So next time you flush your toilet, maybe give a little nod to the chaos it took to get here, and be glad your drinking water doesn't come from a bubbling pit of 19th century despair. Thanks for listening, and if you learned something new, or just feel slightly better about modern plumbing, go ahead and hit that like button. Alright, so now that we've talked about why people were flocking to London to find work, let's explore what types of machines these people were operating, and how they would change the course of history forever. Imagine a world lit only by candles, where most goods were handmade, and the pace of life is dictated by the rising and the setting of the sun. Now imagine that world transformed. Cities glowing with gaslight, trains thundering across the countryside, and factories roaring with the sounds of machines that never sleep. This wasn't a slow and gentle change. It was a revolution, not fought with muskets and cannons, but with gears, steam, and steel. We're now going to dive into the Industrial Revolution and explore the machines that didn't just make life easier, but reshaped human history. In a small Lancashire cottage, a weaver was working late into the night. His family needs the income, but spinning thread, one spindle at a time, well, it's painfully slow. Then, the legend says, his spinning wheel tips over. Instead of stopping, the spindle keeps spinning, and he sees something that no one else has. He builds a frame with 8 spindles, all working at once, and the spinning jenny, just like that, is born. With one worker able to produce multiple thread at once, yarn floods the market. Fabric, it becomes cheaper. And Britain's textile industry, it takes off. But not everyone celebrates. Crowds of spinners, terrified of losing their jobs, smash jennies in protest. This tension between progress and livelihood will haunt the Industrial Revolution for decades to come. If the spinning jenny sped up spinning, the water frame, it industrialized it. The water frame was also a type of spinning machine, but this one, it was powered by rushing rivers. It could spin strong threads 24 hours a day, but it was far too large for a cottage. It demanded a purpose-built factory. Soon, rivers across Britain were lined with brick buildings, their giant water wheels creaking and splashing as they drove the machinery inside. This was the birth of the factory system, the end of a small-scale production, and the beginning of industry on a massive scale. Before steam engines, coal miners had a problem: flooding. Pumps powered by horses can only do so much. And in 1712, a massive machine was built to solve it. The first practical steam machine. It was crude and slow, but it worked. And decades later, James Watt refined the design. His engine was efficient, powerful, not just pumps, but mills, factories, and eventually, vehicles. For the first time in history, power no longer depended on rivers or wind. You could put a steam engine anywhere, and guys, it worked. It was quite literally the engine of change. Next is the power loom. Weaving had long been a skilled, manual craft, but the power loom, well, it could do it automatically. A single factory could now produce more cloth in a week than a village of weavers in an entire year. The result? Clothing became cheaper and more available. The thousands of weavers found themselves unemployed, feeling some uprisings in the early 1800s. Now let's move on. Let's talk about the cotton gin. In America, the booming textile industry needed raw cotton, and lots of it. But the problem? Separating cotton fibers from their seeds was slow, back-breaking work. The cotton gin, invented in 1793, did it in minutes, and the cotton production exploded. But there were dark consequences. Instead of reducing the need for enslaved labor, it increased it. Plantations expanded, and slavery became even more entrenched in the American South. For most of history, traveling faster than a galloping horse was impossible. Then came the steam locomotive. In case you guys don't know, a locomotive is a vehicle used to pull trains along railway tracks. When it was first invented in 1814, it could hit 30 miles per hour, an unheard of speed at that time. Railways connected cities, towns, and industries. Goods that once took weeks to transport could now arrive in days. And for the first time, ordinary people could travel hundreds of miles in comfort and in mere hours. Moving right along to the steamship, the age of steam didn't stop on land. The Clermont, it was the original steamship invented in 1807, and it proved that a ship could travel upriver without a sail or an oar. Steamships turned rivers into highways and oceans into reliable trade routes. Commerce and empires expanded across the globe. Before the telegraph, sending a message across the ocean meant waiting weeks for a ship. Samuel Morse's invention reduced that to minutes. Electrical pulses raced down wires, carrying coded messages over vast distances. The world's first global communications network was born, the Victorian Internet. Do you guys remember when the Titanic sent distress signals to other ships when it struck that iceberg? Well, they used a telegraph. And although it didn't present the terrible disaster, it did play a big role in saving over 700 lives when a nearby ship responded to the distress signals. Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper took the drudgery out of harvesting grain. The mechanical reaper, invented in 1831, was an agricultural machine that increased grain harvesting in a major way. This machine allowed farmers to harvest their crops way quicker and with less manual labor. It let farmers work larger fields, feeding boomer industrial cities and freeing more people to work in the factories. One of the most well-known inventions in this list is the sewing machine, which slashed the time it took to make clothing. Ready-to-made garments became affordable, and fashion became faster, a 19th century version of today's fast fashion. Okay, I said the sewing machine was probably the most well-known invention, but I think I might have spoken too soon. The typewriter, invented in the 1860s, made office work quicker and more legible, and opened new job opportunities for women as typists and secretaries. Before the typewriter was invented, people wrote letters with pens and quills dipped in ink bottles. Can you guys imagine? Actually, I can. You guys, I have a notebook sitting right here next to me that I write notes in all the time. I guess I'm just not really up with the times. But okay, I keep going back and forth on the most popular inventions. But Alexander Graham's Bell telephone? Well, I think it's probably the most popular. It turned the world's whisper into a shout. And for the first time, you could speak to someone hundreds of miles away and hear their voice instantly. The first telephone call was March 10th of 1876, when Alexander made the first successful transmission of speech over a telephone, where he called his assistant and he said, quote, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you," end quote. The Industrial Revolution's machine didn't just change how the world worked. They changed how we lived, how we traveled, how we communicated. They created cities, shaped empires, and set the stage for every invention since. And they began with really simple ideas. A wheel that spun faster, a pump that worked better, a loom that wove without hands. From steam to steel, from telegraphs to telephones, this was the age humanity learned to harness power and to dream bigger than ever before. All right, you guys, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for listening, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. If you have any other topics you would like me to make a video on, go ahead and leave me a comment below. And if you're still awake, I'll keep the fire going for a little bit longer, hoping the soft, crackling noises will put you to sleep. Thank you guys, and we'll see you in the next video.